And it is going to focus, it's about Israel, but it makes references to Ethiopia, which is the first time in Isaiah I think we've seen them, but they're not new to the Bible. They're throughout the Bible. We're going to look at a little bit of that. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. How many of you have seen David Cloud's book, Bible Times and Ancient Kingdoms, or his book on geography? Okay. Those books, while a lot of people would consider them secondary sources or resources, they're very valuable because the entire Old Testament is set in the context of the real world, right? This is not an imaginary world. These places exist. These peoples are real. And if you know where things are and you know who's being talked about, it really does make things a lot clearer. It just does. And so when you're reading along and you're reading about Hebron or Bethel or Samaria, it's nice to know where those things are on a map, you know, and see in your mind's eye, oh, that's here. That's why this was so far. You know, when Elijah ran from Carmel to Ahab's summer palace, which was on the edge of the Jezreel Valley, coming where the mountains, the Judean mountains end in the north. If you know where those things are on a map, you can understand what that means, right? Whereas if you don't, it's just, okay, he ran a long way. See it on the ground especially, you're like, wow, that's a long run. I've ran some pretty long distances in my life. I couldn't run that far, and certainly not faster than a horse, okay? And so it is interesting to know where things are. And we're dealing with some things here in chapter 18 of Isaiah that if you don't know some of the families and where nations and tribes and peoples and tongues came from, it can be confusing. I will tell you that when I read chapter 18 in preparation for this lesson, it's been a while since I'd read it, and I'm reading along. It's probably been about 8 months, I think, since I've read this chapter. And I read it and thought, I have no idea what's going on here. And so I had to do some studying, right? Fortunately, we have really good resources. And one of the big advantages, by the way, to having the English Bible are the resources that go along with it. Okay? So the concordance and all these Bible study materials and commentaries and everything that we have access to, those are all tied to the English Bible. Okay, because the men that wrote them used the English Bible, and that's how they work, and so it's extremely handy. Well, we have good resources, and in my particular case, David Cloud, he's done a review of this, and he pointed out a couple things that just cleared it right up in moments. That's what commentaries are for. That's what makes them useful. Amen. Right? Because candidly, sometimes when you'll read a passage, it's confusing. And this one was to me. So the first point I'll say about it is this. First, it mentions Ethiopia in verse 1. We all see that, right? And then it talks about, in verse 2, go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled. It is your nature in reading through this to link those two things together. I always have. That nation terrible and peeled, scattered and peeled, excuse me. I've always thought of that as Ethiopia, but it's not. And once you understand that it isn't, and how these things are related, the chapter falls into place. Okay, so we'll start here at the beginning. Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. Now, that land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia is known in the Bible as Cush. Okay, it's often translated Cush. Sometimes here it's translated Ethiopia. It's the same word. And Cush is a nation south of Egypt, or I should say a people south of Egypt, that today covers the area of southern Egypt, Sudan, and northern Ethiopia. Okay, that's the area that we're talking about. Okay, so these are a people or a nation. So the Bible doesn't divide. There is no race in the Bible. You all know that, right? There's one human race. God hath made of one blood all men under heaven. So we're all one group of people. But there are differences in families, tongues, tribes, and nations. The Bible does divide by that. And what do those divisions mean? Well, the tongues one is very obvious, right? You speak different languages. Praise God for that, by the way. Okay, he did that on purpose. He did it to stop tyranny. If Nimrod, and I believe Nimrod was the one who built the Tower of Babel, if Nimrod had had his way, he would have gathered all men under his authority by force. And it would have been fairly easy to do with one language. But God stopped that program. Okay? And ever since, men have been trying to overcome that. They've been trying to find a way to get control of everyone regardless of language. But language is a real barrier. So how many of you know or are familiar with the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Okay, prior to World War I, it was one of the big empires in Europe. Had an emperor, the Austrian emperor, right? It was really the reason World War I started. And it basically, it was run out of Austria and Hungary both. That's why it's called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but really out of Austria. Okay, the emperor was, I think, Franz Leopold. Anyway, Franz Joseph. So you had this emperor in Austria who's a German. The Austrians are Germans. Okay, everyone knows that, right? They speak German, they're Germans. Then you have Hungary right next to it. And Hungary was part of the empire. In Hungary, they spoke Hungarian. And so the emperor was both king of Austria and of Hungary. It was a dual throne, which is why on their flag it was an eagle with two heads. It's a really weird looking flag, a two-headed bird. But that's what it was referring to, Austria and Hungary. Okay, now the Hungarians were the Magyars, which were this tribe of Mongolian type people that had come out of Central Asia and into Europe at one point, but they had been mixed with Europeans over centuries. So most Hungarians nowadays, they're Germans, okay? Just like Czechs, okay? Basically Germans. But they spoke their own language, okay? So did the Czechs, so did the Slovaks, so did the Slovenes, so did the Albanians, so did the Serbians, okay? And the empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was made up of all of these peoples. They had Transylvania. That's a real place, by the way, okay? And they had their own language. They had Bulgars who spoke their own language in the empire, even though Bulgaria was separate. There were Bulgars in the empire. There's a whole section of them, a whole section of Romanians, okay? And so the empire struggled to be organized and to have a decent army and a decent administrative state because you had all these different languages. It was very difficult. When they went to war, their army, well, so if you ever study World War I, you'll see the Austrians lost every fight that they fought except with the Italians, okay? But that was mainly because they were on defense against the Italians. They were not attacking. And it was in the Alps, the Italian Alps and the Austrian Alps. And the Italians were attacking across these mountains. If you ever see pictures of it, it's insane. It is how they could think they could move an army through that kind of terrain, I don't know. I mean, we wouldn't do it today. But they tried, and the Italians suffered horrible, severe losses, okay? But everywhere else, the Austrians lost. They lost badly. I mean, the Russians, every time they fought the Russians beat them. They had to get Germans to help them, from the actual Germany, to come down and stiffen their lines and help them win. They couldn't defeat Serbia on their own. Little tiny Serbia, okay, which was the start of this whole war. The Austrians invaded, got driven out, invaded, got driven out, invaded, got driven out. Eventually, they captured the capital. Then they lost it. Finally, the Germans came down and said, get out of the way. And they took care of Serbia. And so, why did they struggle so badly? It was the language. Their army was made up of all these units that spoke different languages. Literally, enormous problems communicating clear commands and orders. Okay? And command and control and clear commands and clear orders, they're an absolute necessity. Plus, the people didn't feel attached to each other because they all spoke different languages. So the point of all this is It is very hard to impose a tyranny on people when you don't share their language. Very hard. And so what God did at the Tower of Babel was really to protect all of us from tyranny. And I think it was to allow the gospel to be spread and not to allow a one world government and one world religion, because that government was tied to a religion, Nimrod's religion, to be imposed on men by force. Okay? So that was the first break. It created all these different languages. Okay? When you don't share a language with someone, even if you share a lot of other things, it's very hard to carry on any kind of relationship with them, friendship of any kind. You can't talk to each other. I mean, we all talk to each other. That's how we have relationships, right? Imagine if God couldn't understand your prayers because you spoke the wrong language. So obviously but the point is, you have a relationship with God. How do you maintain that relationship? You talk to him and he talks to you. That's how it works. You do the same with your spouse, children, and friends and everyone else. So language is the first thing. Then the second is tribes. So mankind was split into different familial groups. Okay? Part of that was language driven. Part of it was just had different ancestors. So they split and scattered throughout the world. And the big three, of course, are Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? The three sons of Noah. Now, they had themselves a lot of different kids, and they also spread out and split among each other. The Middle East was mostly settled by descendants of Shem, but some of the descendants of Ham are in there too. Okay, like Babylon, that's Ham. On the other hand, Assyria is Shem. The Assyrians were Semites. They were descendants of Shem. But the Babylonians, those were from Ham. And the Persians and the Medes, those are from Japheth. So there was all kinds of mixing going on, but they had different descendants. So you have these tribes, these families that spread out over the globe, right? And there's a passage in the Bible that says one child was named Peleg because in his day the land was divided. Now many people believe that's referring to them dividing the land, the earth, by the division of languages at the Tower of Babel. And just by that, they think, okay, this tribe took this piece, this tribe took this piece. I don't think that's what that means at all. I think it's referring to the continents being broken up. I think it was a catastrophic event, probably as world-shattering in terms of the environment and the people involved as the flood, except not everyone died, of course, although I'm sure a lot of people did. So I believe prior to that, you had one big continent. Certainly prior to the flood, you did. Everyone knows that, right? Prior to the flood, there was just one big continent. Okay? The Bible says that clearly. All the land was gathered into one place, and all the seas were gathered into one place. So it was one big piece of land. I think after the flood, men were spreading around. I think God broke the continents apart. And that's what I think is being referred to when it says in Peleg's day, the land was divided. Okay? Which is why you had people everywhere. Now, people were also communicating throughout all of history. The idea that North and South America had no connection at all with East Asia, that's nonsense. There was absolute communication going on back and forth across the oceans and through the islands and so on. But you have these tribes, they spread out, and they're settling in very different, widely scattered locations. So they create their own cultures, right? And those cultures are very different. Because what drives a culture? Well, primarily your geography. The things you're going to do day to day, how you live, things that are important to a people, are going to be driven by your needs based on your geography. If food falls into your lap with almost no effort, you're not going to work that hard on agriculture. Like Polynesia, where food literally falls into your lap with almost no effort. Okay? But if you have to work really hard to extract food from the ground, like in the Scandinavian peninsula, well, then you're going to be serious farmers and serious fishermen, because that's what it takes to survive. And they were. The Vikings were primarily farmers. They were fishermen too, but primarily farmers. Little Ice Age is what drove them out and turned them into crazy barbarian warriors. Okay? So that's another piece that goes along with these tribes, is cultures that develop in a different location, distinct from and separate from cultures elsewhere, right? So Europe has it has several mountain ranges, but to the east of Europe, you have Russia, and it's basically wide open terrain. Okay, there's an Ural Mountain Range out there, but it doesn't go far enough south. And so when the Mongolians decided they're going to conquer to the west and came through Russia, there was nothing to stop them. Nothing at all. They just came right on through. That was bad for the Russians. They spent 100 years several hundred years under Mongol thumbs. But when they got into Europe, they ran into these big terrain-based problems that slowed them dramatically, which protected Europeans from this stuff. So there's these mixing of cultures going on, and they're geographically based. Russians have a panicky fear of open terrain because they've been invaded through it so many times. Seriously, that's true to this day. Makes them very nervous. Not to say that we should feel sorry for Russians. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the terrain creates this sense of national paranoia. The United States, on the other hand, our terrain is fantastic. We have these two borders with basically nations we could slap into the ground if we ever needed to. So they're peaceful borders, because those guys aren't going to cause any trouble, right? There's like, 25 people in Canada? And in Mexico, it's a big desert border, and if we wanted to, we could shut that thing down. And Mexico can't project power, and so if we needed to, we could put it into them. So we have these peaceful borders, and we have these giant oceans. People have trouble getting to us. It has changed our national culture. We feel invulnerable because of it. We're not, but we feel that way. And so you have that effect from these tribes. So you have the languages and the tribes, and then you have peoples, which I think has to do with larger tribal groups. So collections of groups. It's multiple tribes that speak the same or very similar languages. German and Dutch and Austrian are very similar languages, but they're not identical. Austrian's as close to German as you can be. It's like us in the English, right? They speak English, we speak English. They speak a weird nonsense version of it, but, it's a form of English. We speak real English, or what we used to call American, because there is such a thing as the American language. It is different than the English. But everyone calls it English, whatever. German and Dutch is a lot like that. Because they're related families, even though they're separate as a people, right? Or as tribes. But as peoples, they're related, and they're very similar. Similarly, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, right? And in the British Isles, you have the Celtic peoples. So you have the Britons, not the English, the Britons, okay? And the Welsh, and the Scottish, also known as the Picts. Bunch of crazy psychopaths that crowd was for a long time. And the Irish, right? Those are Celtic tribes. And they all spoke very similar languages. Not identical, but very similar. They could communicate with each other. Nowadays, if you try to talk to a Welshman and he speaks Welsh, good luck. That language is nuts. But that's the same with speaking Gaelic in Ireland. Okay, or traditional Pictish. Not a lot of records of Pictish, because they didn't write a lot down. And so you have that. And then you have nations. And the nations are nowadays, because of all the mass migration and conquest and everything else that's been going on, and marriages, across lines, nations are now basically defined primarily geographically. However, there is a cultural component to a nation, right? You all agree on certain things. That's why we're a nation. When that is lost, you're not a nation anymore. So in the Bible, you have those divisions, these nations, peoples, tongues, and tribes. And Cush is one of those, also known as Ethiopia. He is a descendant of Ham. It is fairly clear that he was black. That does not, I want to make clear, According to the Bible, there is no negative connotation to skin color. There just isn't. I know people want there to be somehow, but it really has nothing to do with skin color. It has to do with beliefs, culture. The problem that black human beings have had is that the vast majority of them have lived in and grown up in wicked, pagan, spiritist cultures, and nowadays Muslim. Those are basically their choices. And what do those things produce? Well, they produce people who act terribly. In the United States, we have a separate culture, the black inner city culture. That's part of our homegrown American culture. Is there anything good about that nonsense? No, it's terrible. Right? What does that culture promote? Lawlessness, violence, right? Children out of wedlock, the largest percentage of abortions in the world. I mean, it's a terrible culture, just a terrible one. And it hasn't produced good things at all. But it's a homegrown American one, and it has produced a very tiny slice of our population, less than 2%, that commits more than half of the violent crimes in the country. More than half. Okay? You know, if you watch the news, you would think that there's a plague of white people hunting black people down and killing them. You would believe that. The news says things like that all the time. White supremacy, racists, and all this other nonsense. And the cops are killing black men left and right. None of that is true. It just isn't. Last year, there were 87, I think, people, black people killed by white people in some sort of criminal interaction. So a death caused by a white person on a black person that was criminal, not accidental. There were 580-something white people killed by black people. Black people only make up 13% of the population. White people make up 65%. You see the difference? There's a lot more of us, and we kill a lot fewer of them. They're the ones doing the killing. They mostly kill each other, but they do it so often that sometimes they spill out and kill white people. And no one wants to talk about that, but that is the reality. Those are the numbers. And the people doing it, really, it's not even the bulk of the black population. It's a very tiny slice, and it's black men between 16 and 40, and not even the bulk of them. It's just a small percentage of them. And they're the ones that drive our crime rate really high. That's our culture. We built that in this country, and we did it on purpose as a nation. When we created the Great Society in the 60s, what was the goal? Well, when the Democrats got that passed, the goal was to convince black Americans to vote Democrat. That's the simple goal. And we'd put them on welfare so they'd vote Democrat. That's literally what it was about. There's a quote by Lyndon Johnson, which I will not repeat, where he says that. We'll have the blanks voting for us for 100 years. Okay, that was the purpose. It was really that simple. But in the application of this welfare state, focused on the inner cities, it destroyed black families. Because if you could survive without a husband, you didn't have to stay married. You'd have to get married in the first place. And in no time, I mean, it happened very fast. The unwed mother rate in black inner cities went from about 13% to over 90% now. That's just how it is. So we created that, okay? And unfortunately, it's a terrible, terrible culture. So you have these cultural conflicts and problems. Now, in this particular case, Israel and Judah are terrified of this Assyrian invasion coming from the north, right? And they're looking for help. And so who do they reach out to? Do they reach out to God? Well, no. They look for allies. Okay? And the two allies they look to are Egypt and Ethiopia. Ethiopia at this time was at war with Assyria. They lost the war, but they were at war with Assyria at this time. And so Here in verse 1 it says, "Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia." There are 3 large rivers that cut that land apart. "That sendeth ambassadors by the sea." So this land, Cush, sends ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters, saying, "Go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled." So who are those ambassadors going to? Well, they were coming to Israel. That's the nation scattered and peeled. Okay? So the people that are scattered and peeled, a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled, that's Israel. Okay, and so these ambassadors were to be coming to them. Turn to Isaiah chapter 20. Keep your finger here, but turn over there. Look at verse 5. This is talking about Israel. "And they shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectation, and of Egypt, their glory." See, Israel was trying to arrange alliances with Egypt and Ethiopia to defeat the Assyrians. That's where their expectation was. Where's our expectation supposed to be? In the Lord, right? So I'm going to use myself as an example. I don't like to do that very much, although, we experience our own lives, and so we have to draw examples from what we know. Everyone knows, I think, because I've told the church, I've got this problem coming up with my job, right, over the next few months. Don't know how that's going to go. There are possible options, and they may be foreclosed for all I know. I just don't know. My expectation can't be in the commissioners or the prosecutor or a judge. It cannot be. It has to be in the Lord. I have to let him decide. I don't think God tells you, okay, sit on your hands and do nothing. Does he ever say that anywhere? I mean, you can't find that. He does say, be quiet and know that I am the Lord, right? He tells you not to worry. Be careful for nothing, right? You're supposed to take it to him in prayer. But he never tells you to not work and be rational and try to take care of things in this life. But you do that with the understanding that it's his business that you're doing, and he'll open and close doors, right? And they'll be whatever they are. He knows what he's doing. We, not so much. Well, Israel here, they had decided that their salvation lie in Ethiopia and Egypt. And it does not go their way. Both those nations actually get defeated by Assyria. Now, Cush had been around for a long time. It's one of the, also Ethiopia, one of the earliest nations mentioned. Go to chapter 2 of Genesis. And look at verse 13. "And the name of the second river is Gihon, the same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia." Now this is one of the 4 rivers that came out of Eden. How big was Eden? We have no idea. Sounds really big, right? Sounds like it covered basically the Middle East. I mean, these 4 rivers are separated by, at least on today's geography, they're separated by the 3 rivers we know of. I mean, the 4th one we're not certain. But we know, the Tigris, we know the Nile, and we know this river, Gihon. We don't know Hiddekel, I'm not certain. But anyway, we know where 3 of these rivers are, and they're separated by massive terrain. Now, it could be that those 3 rivers are not the same ones that existed then, right? That the geography changed because of the flood, and so they named these new rivers they found almost immediately the same names they had the old ones. But this one specifically says, the one that encompasseth the land of Ethiopia. It refers to it by name, which means it sounds like that one's in the same place it was. Okay? Although the geography might have moved, the ground might have moved some by the division of the earth. So Ethiopia is well known in the Bible. Go to Genesis chapter 10. There are a few studies of what's known as the Table of Nations. They're very helpful and useful, so if you get a chance, I know David has one, but there's another one put out by Answers in Genesis, and another one put out by the Creation Research Institute, which is Henry Morris. Those studies of these family lines are very fascinating and enlightening. You'll learn some things about how the world was settled and where people come from. So look at verse 6. And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim and Phut and Canaan. Now, so, we see 4 of Ham's sons listed here. Cush, that is Ethiopia. Mizraim is Egypt. These are the original Egyptians. Okay, the father of them is Mizraim. Phut is what we know as Libya. Okay, also called Put, P-U-T. And then Canaan, everyone knows that guy, right? And he settled, of course, where he wasn't supposed to settle. He settled in Israel's land, and the Canaanites were there. But, so that's basically where Ham's first 4 children settled. But then they had children that spread from there, okay? And so if you go through the Table of Nations, but there is the genesis of Ethiopia. So it looks like 2 of Ham's sons were black, okay? Put and Cush, because all the people that descended from them are. The Mizraim, the original Egyptians, were not black. They were not white either. They were sort of an olive brown. I'm talking about the original Egyptians, okay, not modern Egyptians who were all Arabs. And the Canaanites, we don't really know what their skin color was. We know it wasn't black. There's too many descriptions of them that they're clearly not black. But we don't know what color their skin was. Okay. So a lot of people prior to the Civil War especially, a lot of people would say, well, they would try to somehow to tie the mark of Cain onto black people. That's nonsense, of course. That all ended with the flood. Cain's line was wiped out, his male line. And then they would try to put it on the curse on Canaan, right? Ham's son Canaan, and say, well, see, his descendants, were also, Ham's descendants were black, so they should be slaves because they're cursed by God. But if you read the passage, Ham himself was not